Welcome to part 3 of this tutorial series where we're creating this low poly isometric kitchen scene in Blender. So in parts 1 and 2 we had done all the basic modeling, and in this part we're going to be doing the lighting and the UV unwrapping and the materials. And speaking of lighting, I did want to really quick let you know about an amazing Blender add-on for getting realistic skies in Blender, the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere Blender add-on. Physical Starlight and Atmosphere is an amazing Blender add-on for creating realistic skies and sky lighting. I've used the add-on myself and I highly recommend it. You can customize the sun, atmosphere, stars, clouds, fog, and more. The add-on also provides some outstanding sky presets, such as daytime and sunset, fog and haze, Mars, and even retrowave. You can also change the time of day just by rotating the sunlight. Check out the add-on with the link in the description, and by purchasing the add-on through my link, you'll be helping to support this channel. Alright, so let's get started with this part. So I'm first going to click right over here on the world properties because I want to add in the HDRI that I mentioned in part 1 of the tutorial series. So if you don't already have a new world, you can click on the new button, and then to add in the HDRI, you can click on color here, click on the yellow dot, and then we want to change this to the environment texture. And then I can click on open to open up the HDRI. And here's the HDRI that I'm going to be using, the Photo Studio Broadway Hall. Again, links in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version, so you can just click on Open Image. So now if I hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view, we can actually see it lighting up the scene. And then as I mentioned in part 1 of the tutorial series, I'm going to be using Cycles Render because I do want very realistic lighting, but you could also use Eevee if you want to. Now if you go back here to the world properties, I actually want to make the HDRI brighter, so on the strength here I'm just going to turn this up to 2. Now that might look a bit too bright because it does look really bright, everything is very white, but that's just because none of these objects have materials, so once the objects have materials they will look darker. Now also you can see that Blender is having to render everything around the camera, and I only want Blender to render what the camera can see. So in the camera view I can press Ctrl B and I can drag a box around the camera, and this will add a render region so it'll only render what the camera can see, and that'll speed up the render preview in the viewport. So now I also want to add a sunlight so that we get some nice direct lighting on our objects. So I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go down here to light, and I'm going to add the sunlight. And then I can rotate the sunlight over and kind of bring it over, and I'm going to go back to solid view, and I want to bring the light up right here and just kind of place it so it's rotating sideways, kind of like that, because I want some of the light to look like it's coming through the window and kind of have some shadows here, and I also want some direct lighting on the ground, so something like that. Now also if you go right here to the object data properties of the light, I want to make the light brighter, so I'm going to turn the strength to 25. I think 25 works really well. And then on the color here, to make it look a little bit more like sunlight, I'm going to make it a very slight yellow tint, just something like that. Now if I go back into the camera view and go into the rendered mode, you can see there's a super bright shadow here, and the shadows are very sharp. Now if I change this angle, it's going to make the shadows more sharp or less sharp. So if I turn the angle way down, it's a super sharp shadow, or if I turn the angle way up, you can barely see the shadows. And so I don't want the shadows to be quite that sharp, so I'm going to turn the angle to 10. That way it still is pretty sharp, but it is a little bit more blurry. And then let's also change the color management. So I'm going to go here to the render properties, and you can open up the color management tab. And I'm going to use the view transform of filmic because that is more realistic. And then on the look here, I'm going to change this to very high contrast. And I know it looks super bright and blown out, but once we add materials, it'll look better. And by changing it to very high contrast, it'll make the colors more contrasty and saturated, and it'll make it look nicer. So now we can do the UV unwrapping and the materials. So I'm first going to start by adding the different materials, and then as we need to, we can UV unwrap the objects. So I'm first going to click on this object here in the background, and then let's click right over here to the shading workspace. And I can go into the camera view. I'm going to hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view, and I just want to click on the new button right here in the shader editor to add a new material, and I can just rename this to background. Now I'm going to click on the base color here on the principled shader, and I'm going to make this fully black so it's much darker, but you can see it's still reflecting quite a bit of the light. So I'm going to take the specular value and I'm going to turn this way down to a 0.1. So if we turn the specular down, it's not going to be quite as reflective, and so now we have this really nice black background, and it brings your eyes into the center of the scene. And that is it for the background material. It's a very simple material. So I now want to click right here on the big object here on the walls and the ground, and I want to click on new to add a new material, and I can just call this material walls. And then this wall material is going to be created procedurally. Now while we're working with the procedural nodes, I'm going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and then over there in the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and just checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on so it's built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture, and let's drop it down here. And then to use the feature of the Node Wrangler, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes, and that is using the Node Wrangler add-on, and it's going to preview the node on the object. And then also with the noise texture selected, I can press Control T, that's using another feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and I want to use the object coordinate, so let's put the object into the vector of the mapping, and then the mapping can go into the vector of the noise texture. And the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I want to turn the scale way up, and I'm actually going to turn the scale up to 180. So now if I zoom in really close, you can see the noise is very small. I'm also going to turn the detail all the way to the max of 15, so it's very detailed, and then also I do want a tiny bit of distortion, so I'll turn the distortion to 0.1. So I now want to put this into the normal of the material to give it a tiny bit of bump. So let's take the factor of the noise texture, and I can put that into the normal of the principled shader, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now you can see it's not really doing anything, and if you look at this at a certain angle, there might be some weird shading issues, like right behind there you can see there's some weird shading problems, and that is because we need to convert the black and white factor data into normal data that the principled shader can actually use. So to convert it, I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the bump node, and we want to put the bump node in between the noise texture and the normal, and then to actually convert it properly, we want the factor to be going into the height value of the bump. So now if I zoom in here, zoom in closely, you can see it's actually looking bumpy. Now it is a bit hard to see, that's because I need to change the color. So I'm going to click on the base color here, the principled shader, and I'm going to make this kind of like a dark brown on the walls. And if you want to use the exact same base color that I'm using, then here on the base color, if you go to the hex value, you can punch in 3.5, 2D, 2.4. That is the exact color that I'll be using. And then if you want to, you could also change the roughness, so you could make it a bit more rough or a bit more shiny. I actually think 0.5 looks pretty good for the roughness. Now that is actually quite bumpy, and so I want to take the bump strength and I want to turn that down to make it less strong. And I'm actually going to turn the bump strength to a 0.05, so it is pretty subtle. But if you zoom in there, you can definitely see there's a little bit of bump. And so that looks really nice. And that is it for the material for the walls. So it's actually pretty simple. Now the next material that I'm going to be adding is the floor material, and for that floor material I'm going to be using my procedural tile floor, and this is a material that I recently posted on my YouTube channel. So if you'd like to pause this video and go over and watch that tutorial, you can then add the material into the other scene. Or if you'd like to help support me and this channel, you can purchase this material on my Gumroad store, and you can also get access to this material on my Patreon page as well. So you can watch the tutorial, or you can also purchase it here. So links will be in the description. So I'm now going to be appending in the material into this 3D scene. So to add it in, let's click here on File, and then we can click on Append. And then you can just locate to the project files of the material, whether you've done the tutorial or if you've purchased the project files. I'm going to go inside the Blender file, and then I can go into material, and then I can just select the tile floor, and it's going to add the material into this Blender file. So I'm now going to go right back here to the layout, and I want to hold down the Z button and go back to solid view. And I want to select the floor objects. So I'm going to select this object, press the tab key to go into edit mode, and I actually just want to select the faces that I want to assign the floor material to. So I'm going to click right here to go to the face select, and then I can hold down the shift key and select these three faces on the ground. So I'm now going to click right over here to the material properties, and we want to add a new material within this object's material slot. So let's click on the plus here to add a new material, and then I can click on the drop down, and I want to add the tile floor material. And then I can click on the assign button, and because this is selected, it's going to assign that material to that part of the object. So I can now go right back over here to the shading workspace. And if I tab to go back to object mode, you can now see it is on the floor. And then right over here, here is the procedural tile floor material. And in the tutorial, I showed you how to compile it together into this nice shader with custom values, or if you've purchased the material, then you'll already get it pre-set up. Now I do want to change some of the settings on the tile floor. So I'm going to hold down the shift key and then drag the scale value. And I actually want to zoom in here very close. And then I want to hold down the shift key and drag the scale value so that the center of the tile or the end of the tile is right there in the corner. So I'm just going to keep on changing this value till it's somewhere where I like. So for my scene, it looks like a scale value of 1.112 is pretty good. So now you can see that where the tiles end, it's in the corner there. And then another thing that I want to do is actually change the colors. So what I'm going to do is click on the tile floor, and then I will press the tab key or just click on this button here to go into the node group. And I just want to add an RGB curves right here before it goes into the base color, because I do want to make the tile floor just a bit darker. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the RGB curves node, and let's put the RGB curves in between the mix and the principled shader. And so now I just want to click right here to add a dot, and I'm just going to drag this down so it's a little bit darker. And then if I click here on the R, that is for red, and I can click here to just drag it up a little bit so it's a bit more red. And also if I wanted to, I could maybe drag this over and maybe bring it up, and then instead bring another dot down here. And if you add a nice curve right there on the C value, that's going to kind of make it a bit more contrasty. And if you Control Shift and select the RGB curves, you can kind of see what it's doing, although it does look really dark. So I will just Control Shift and select the principled shader. If I select the RGB curves, you can press the M key and that'll mute the node. And so I can press the M key and go back and forth, and you can see it's just a bit darker and a bit more saturated now. So I like that a bit better. So I will press the tab key to go back out of this group, and then there is the temporary viewer, so I can just Control Shift and select the shader to get rid of it. So there we go, we now have a nice tile floor for our kitchen. So let's now create the wood material for the stool. So I'm just going to select the stool, let's click on new, and I can just call this like wood 1, because we're going to be having 2 different wood materials. So then right here on the principled shader, I'm going to be adding in some wood textures that I got from Ambient CG. So link will be in the description if you'd like to download the free textures, and I mentioned them in part 1 of the tutorial series. So with the principled shader selected, I'm going to press Control Shift T. And this is going to bring up Blender's file browser, and then you can just locate to the folder on your computer where you save the image textures. So I downloaded the Wood 023 from Ambient CG, links in the description if you'd like to download it, and I downloaded the 4K JPEG version on Ambient CG. So once you download the textures, you're going to get a zip file, and you can just extract the zip file and then go into the folder. And so I'm going to select the color, I'm going to hold down the Control key and select the roughness, and then also the normal GL. So the roughness, normal GL, and color, and then I can click on Principled Texture Setup. And this is using the feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's automatically going to set up all the texture maps for us, and it'll save a lot of time. Now I want to re-UV unwrap this because you can see the UV unwrapping doesn't look that good. The texture isn't placed very well in the object. So I'm going to click right here to go to the UV editing layout. And this will take us into edit mode of the object which was selected. So I can zoom in here, and then I can hold down the Z button, and I can go into the material preview to actually see the material on the object. So here's the UV mapping, but that isn't very good. So I'm just going to select everything, and then I'll just hit the U button, and I can just click on the Smart UV Project, and then click on OK. And the Smart UV Project will work very well for just simple objects like this. And then also you can see that the wood texture, the wood grain is going back and forth, but I instead want it to be going up and down. So here in the UV editing, I can press the A key to select everything, and I'm going to rotate it, and I'll type in 90 and then enter. So it's rotated over by 90 degrees. I could also scale it down if I want the textures to be a bit bigger. And now you can see that the grain of wood is going along the stool leg. So that is good, and we can go back to the shading tab. Now this stool is very bright, and so I want to make it a bit darker. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the RGB curves, and we want to put the RGB curves node after the base color before the principled shader. So this will allow us to edit the base color. So I can now click and drag this down to make it darker. So you can now see the wooden stool is quite a bit darker. So I just want to drag that down to maybe about there. You can also click here on the R for red, and you could drag this up if you want a bit more red. I think I actually want a bit less red, so it looks maybe a little bit more brown. So I'll just drag that down a little bit and click back here on the C, and I can kind of drag this down a little bit more. So something like that looks pretty good. Alright, so that is it for the wooden stool material. So I'm now going to click on the cabinets and we're going to add the other wood material. So I'm going to click on new here to add a new material on this object, and I can rename it to wood 2 because this is the other wood material. So I now want to do the same thing, so I'm going to use the feature of the node wrangler to automatically set up all the texture maps. So with the principled shader selected, you can press Ctrl-Shift-T. And again, this will bring up Blender's file browser, and I'm going to go into the other folder. So this texture, the other texture that I downloaded, is the Wood 025 on Ambient CG, and I downloaded the 4K JPEG version. So links in the description if you'd like to download it. So I'm going to select the color, and then hold down the Control key and select the roughness and the normal GL, and then I can click on the principled texture setup. So there we go, we now have a nice wood material on those cabinets. But I definitely need to UV unwrap it because you can see there's a bunch of stretching and problems. So with this object selected, we can click right here to go to the UV editing workspace, and I can press the A key to select the entire mesh. Then I can press the U button, and I can again just do the Smart UV Project and then click on OK, and it's going to do a pretty good job. Now there are a few things that I want to change. So the grain of wood is going back and forth this way, but I instead want it to be going the opposite direction. So press the A key to select everything, and I can rotate it by 90 degrees and then hit enter, and that looks a bit better. And if you want to rotate anything else, you can. So I'm just kind of looking around at the mesh, but I think I like how that is. But if you, for instance, wanted to rotate a single face, you could select the face, and when you select it in the 3D viewport, it's going to select it in the UV editor. And so you could move this around, you could scale it up, or you could also rotate it if you want to change the rotation of the grain of wood. I'm also going to press the A key to select everything, and here in the UV editor, I will scale everything up so that there is a bit more grain of wood and it's a bit smaller. So that looks pretty good. So I can now go right back over here to the shading layout. Now this wood is very bright, and it's also a little bit orangey or a little bit red, and so I want to make it a bit darker. So let's press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and again I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and let's put the RGB curves in between the base color and the principled shader. And then I can click and drag to add a dot here, and I'm going to drag this down. I'm also going to add another one, and I'm going to bring this down as well. And you can see now that I brought this down, it is still kind of red color, but it's much darker. And then also if you click here on the R for red, I could drag this down just to make the red a little bit less strong, and that is pretty good. So I like that much better. That is a much nicer color of wood. So I now want to add this same material to this object right up here. So what I can do is actually just click and drag on this material, and we can drop the material onto this object, or you can select the object and click on the drop down and add the wood to material. Now you can see this one needs to be UV unwrapped as well. So let's click right here to go to the UV editing workspace, and you can see that it still has the mirror modifier, and I don't want the mirror modifier because the texture is going to look mirrored. So let's click here on the modifier properties, and I need to press tab to go back to object mode, and you can see here's the mirror modifier. So to apply it, I can just click on the drop down and then click on apply. So now if I go back into edit mode, you can see it's all actual geometry. So I can now press the U button with the mesh selected, and I can do the Smart UV Project and click on OK. And then I can press the A key to select the UV mapping, and I can scale it up a little bit. Something like that. And then I can take a look at the wood grain, and I actually want to rotate it over. So in edit mode, I can rotate this, and I'll type in 90 and enter. So now the grain of wood is rotated over, and that is looking pretty good. And if you want to rotate anything over, you can just by selecting it and then rotating it. That looks good though, so let's go back to the shading workspace, and we now have wood right there on the top cabinets. Alright, so let's now add that same material to these shelves right here. So you can just click on this object, and you can drag the wood 2 onto the shelves, or just click on the shelves and then select the wood 2 material. And then we need to UV unwrap this as well. So let's click right over here to go to the UV editing. I'm going to go down here, press the A key to select the entire mesh, and I can press U, and let's do the Smart UV Project again, and then I can just click on OK. And then because it's kind of in a shadow, it is a little bit hard to see the material. So what I can do up here is actually scroll over, and if you click here on this arrow to go to the viewport shading, I can use the scene lights and the scene world. So this is basically going to show what the scene would look like if it was rendered in Eevee, because the material preview uses Eevee, and I'm telling it to use the scene lights and and world. So now it's a bit easier to see the material. So now I can tab to go into edit mode. I want to press the A key to select everything, and I'm going to scale this down so it's a bit smaller. And then this is also longer going back and forth, so I want to rotate the UV editing, and I'll rotate it by 90 degrees and then hit enter. And that looks a lot better. So let's go back over here to the shading layout. Now let's do some of the metal materials. So I'm first going to select the faucet, and then let's click on the new button to add a new material. And I'm just going to rename this material to metal because we're going to be adding this material to some of the different objects. So for this metal material, I'm just going to set it to kind of like a light gray, and then so that it's metallic, I can turn the metallic value all the way up to 1. And just so that this loads up faster in the viewport, in the camera view, I can press Ctrl B, I can drag a box just around the area, and then I can zoom in just so that it renders a bit faster. And then I also want to turn the roughness down, so I think a roughness value of 0.3 looks pretty good. Now I want to add this same metal material to the sink. So I'm going to hold down the Z button and actually go into the material preview to see this. And I can do the same thing in this view here, so I can click on the drop down arrow and I can choose the scene lights and the world lights, and that makes it a bit easier to see. So I can select the cabinet here, and I can tab to go into edit mode and make sure you're in the face select, and I'm going to hold down the alt key and select that loop of vertices. Then I can hold down the shift and alt key and select that loop of vertices, and then zoom in really closely and shift alt select that loop and that loop and that loop. And then also if I press the period on the numpad to zoom into the sink, I want to hold down the Z button and go into wireframe, and I can just press B for the box select and just box select all those other faces there. And I actually don't want this face selected, so press B for the box select, and I'm going to click and drag with my mouse wheel to deselect that one that I accidentally selected. And I can go back into solid view, actually into the material preview, that's better, and that is the area that I want to be the sink. So now what I can do is click right over here to go to the material properties, and I want to add another material in this object's material slot. So I can click on the plus here to add a new material, and then if you click on the drop down, I can add the metal material. Now I want to assign those faces to that material, so with those faces selected, you can click on the metal material in the material slot and just click on the assign button. And then I can go back to object mode, and you can now see we have the sink material. Now this same metal material I can add to the dishwasher and the oven. So I'm just going to select the dishwasher object and then click on the drop down here, and I can add the metal material. And then I can also navigate over here to the oven. I can select the oven and then click on the drop down. I can add the metal, and also I can click on the handle here, click on the drop down and add the metal material. Now I want to add another darker material for the top of the oven, so I'll select the oven and go into edit mode, and I'm just going to select the top face. And I want to press the I key to inset that face, and I just want to scale it down a little bit smaller, just like that. Then I'm going to hover my mouse over the circles here and press the L key to select the stove tops. And then I want to add a new material. So in the material slot, I'm going to click on the plus to add a new material. Let's click on the drop down, and I can add the metal material. But I now want to duplicate this metal material and make it different. So I'm going to click on this file icon right here. It kind of looks like two pieces of paper, and that'll duplicate the material. So it now is called metal 001. And I can just rename this to metal dark. So it's now a different material, but it has the same data. So I can now just click on the base color here, and I want to make this much darker. And then you can't see it taking effect. That's because I need to assign the dark metal to this part of the object. So with that part of the object selected, I can click on the assign button, and then I can press tab to go back to object mode. And I just want to make the base color pretty dark for this material. And I can also hold down the Z button and go into the rendered view to actually see what it'll look like in cycles render. And I actually want to turn the roughness a bit down. So I'm going to turn the roughness to like 0.2, so it's a little bit more reflective. And I can go into the camera view, and I can press Control B in the camera, drag a box around the camera just to see how that's looking like, and that is pretty good. Now let's click right back over here to the layout so I can see this in full screen, and I'm going to hold down the Z button and go into the material preview, and actually we can do the same thing. So here on the drop down arrow, we can click on the scene world and scene lights just so we can see that a bit better. It's just a bit easier to do in the layout because we have the full screen. So I also want to add that dark metal material to the window, the oven window, and also the clock there. So I'll tab to go into edit mode, press the A key to deselect everything, and then I'll hold down the alt key, select that loop of vertices, and then just shift select that face there. And then also right down here I can do the same thing. I'm just going to shift select that face there. So I can now click on the dark metal, and then I can click on the assign button. Now I can also add the same dark metal material to the handles. So I'll tab to go back to object mode. I can select the handle object, and then I can click on the drop down, and I can click on the metal dark. Let's also click here on the matte, and I can click on new to add a new material, and I can just call this matte. And then right here on the base color, I can just make this kind of like a dark gray color, make it pretty dark. And then I'm also going to turn the roughness down so it's a little bit more shiny and maybe make it a little bit darker. Let's also go right up here and we're gonna select the exhaust fan, and I can click on the drop down, and let's add that base metal material. But then this material, I want it to be slightly different. So I'm going to click on this file icon here, that'll duplicate the material, and I can call it metal and then like just fan, metal fan. Now for this material, I want to make the base color a little bit darker, so I'll turn it down just a little bit. So it's a bit darker of a gray color. And then I also want it to be a little bit more shiny, so I will turn the roughness to like a 0.25 just so it's a bit more shiny, and I can go into the rendered viewport just to see how that's looking. So I'm going to hold down the Z button and go back to the material preview. So I can now add the material to the window frame here. So I'm just going to select the window frame. Let's click on new, and I could just call this like frame or window frame. And then this material again is pretty simple. I'm just going to click on the base color, and I'm going to make this kind of like a light tan color. And if you want to use the same color that I'm using, I'll be using a hex value of 746C61. So that is pretty good. And then let's also do the window material. So I'm going to select the window here. And for the window material, I'm going to be creating a custom glass shader. So I'm going to click right back here to go to the shading workspace. And then I can click on the new button here in the shader editor, and I can just rename this to glass. So to make this material, I'm first going to take the transmission of the principled shader, and I'm going to turn that all the way up to 1 so that it looks more like glass and it's see-through. And then also I need to turn the roughness value all the way to 0 so that you can see through it. Now I want to mix this principled shader with a transparent shader. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the transparent, and let's drop the transparent right here. And then I want to mix these two shaders together. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select both shaders. And then I can press Control 0, and that is using a feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add this mix shader and mix them both together. And then I will just leave the factor at 0.5. So I think mixing the transparent with the principled shader gives it a really nice effect. So you can see it's pretty reflective. You can see it's kind of reflecting things in the window, but it's also very transparent. And I've also found that this shader works a little bit better for the light shining through the window. You could, of course, press Shift A and you could search for the glass shader if you wanted to. You could use the glass shader, so I could put that up to the surface, but I actually like how this other shader looks like. So I'm going to instead put the mix shader into the surface, and I can just delete the glass shader. And with that all finished, this is going to wrap it up for part 3 of the tutorial series. So I hope you've been enjoying this so far, and thank you for watching. And in the last part, in part 4, I'm going to quickly go over how I modeled some of the different prop objects. So I'll show you some of the different objects that I modeled, and then I'll show you how to kind of place them around in the scene. And then we will do the rendering and the compositing to get the finished image. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel and purchase the finished project files of this tutorial, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the last part.